Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mariam Hussein, and I'm on the board of NIMS. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. We're really excited to have you, and as well as our speaker. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We're all very excited to have you here. This is our next installment of the webinar series that we hold throughout the year. So as a quick reminder about NIMS, it's the Nagamiya Institute of Islamic Medicine and Science. And our mission and vision is to acquire and disseminate knowledge of the rich history of Islamic medicine that we have, as well as art and culture, and foster its application, inshallah. And so this webinar series that we do throughout the year is just to help bring the knowledge that we already have and then help bring very scientific evidence as well as historical evidence to help people understand what are the implications of that knowledge and how it's been used throughout the years and how it impacts us today. So really excited to have our speaker here today, Dr. Nahyan Fancy. He is the al-Qasimi Professor of Islamic Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter in England. He's a historian of science by training, and he focuses on the intersections of medicine, philosophy, and religion in pre-modern Islamic societies. He's also the author of Science and Religion in Mamluk, Egypt, Ibn al-Nafis, Pulmonary Transit and Bodily Resurrection. So a perfect speaker for our today's topic. I think the other thing that's really interesting too, so thankfully Dr. Nahyan and I have known each other for a few years now, and I feel like I learn something new every time we talk about the history of Islamic medicine. And there's a certain, I know one thing that I get, I guess, happy about that I'm learning, but wish I had known before was just that there's a certain framework that we're taught our own history. And then so it's very it's very enlightening when we have someone from who truly understands the background, the science, the history of it, and can help explain and put things into more context for us. So without further ado, Dr. Nahyan, welcome. Thank you for doing this webinar with us and looking forward to learning from you as well.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you to Dr. Mariam Hussein. Thank you to the Nagamiya Institute for the invitation, and to Dr. Mariam for all the excellent conversations over the past couple of years that we've known each other predominantly virtually. We're, of course, hoping that we can, inshallah, work with Nagamiya Institute and turn this into a series of webinars to help bring a better, what I would call an up-to-date academic understanding of the history of medicine in Islamic societies to a broader public, and still hopefully make it such that academics will find it useful as well, and not just for a public audience. I'd also like to thank the tech team and the background, and Alia in particular, for all her help on today's event. So let me get to the meat of the talk then. The focus today is really going to be on two things, I would say. One, the achievements in theoretical medicine and advances away from the earlier medicine found in the work of Ibn Nafis, who died in 1288, and his successors. The period usually people otherwise think of as a decline period or something, and I'm going to challenge that in specific ways, and you'll see. And two, how to understand those achievements, even if there is no direct straight line from those achievements to modern medicine. That is going to be tricky, this latter point. And I want to immediately say that the actual field of history of science and medicine has often struggled with this second point over the last 5 decades, at least, if not earlier, since the publication of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But it is really important to come up with metrics which do not judge achievements of the past solely based on what we now also accept. I'm flagging this now, and we'll keep returning to it to some degree as I proceed through the various examples. To give you a completely unrelated to Islamic medicine example, right? But if you think about, let's say, 19th century, 18th and 19th century physics in Western Europe, there was a long-standing belief in something called the material ether, which pervaded the universe above the sphere of the moon. And over the course of the 19th century, there was a lot of work that went into understanding light as waves moving through a solid ether in the universe. And this includes people you've heard of, like Maxwell and Fresnel and others. And we do not accept the existence of the solid ether, and we explain their results differently while using some aspects of their mathematical tools. But relativity in modern physics is, of course, completely different from that 19th century phenomenon. However, no one says 19th century physics was in decline, right? I think that's the point I want to get at, is that we can talk about advances. People are working with the materials that they have particular theoretical conceptions, they have certain assumptions, they do observe, and it's not a simple, straightforward thing. Science is quite messy and historically always has been. So bear that in mind as we go through today's examples. So now let's get to the matter in hand. Did Ibn Nafis discover blood circulation? The dominant views before my own work, and I'm really sad to say, even after my dissertation was publicly available in 2006 and published as a book in 2013, have been the following. On the one hand, and I'm going to cycle through and hopefully successfully get the slide to move. Yep, thankfully. The dominant views, on the one hand, there were the views of academic historians, and here are some samples, right? This is Max Meyerhoff all the way back in 1935, who wanted to say, well, Ibn Nafis did discover, as he says, the theory of the lesser circulation, but the only credit we can give him is that he made a happy guess. Or Manfred Ullmann from the 1970s, really still working with what Max Meyerhoff had said, saying, he described the first time the circulation of the lungs, but he gained his knowledge not on the basis of systematic physiological research, but by plain deduction. And he says, two people briefly mention his work. He's picking up on another person, Albert Iskander's work, and says, but that's it. It didn't really go anywhere. And Louis Magner, more recently, is more of a physician writing a history of medicine, I think, in that kind of genre. I don't know his personal actual background, I should say, but it's in that genre of kind of popular works. And he says, it's not clear how Ibn Nafis reached his theory of pulmonary circulation, but he was critical of Galenic dogma. But, some obscure manuscript may still reveal people were interested in, but no evidence suggests that they were interested in his anti-Galenic speculations, as he says in the quote. So all of them want to say that he discovered something called the lesser circulation or pulmonary circulation, which now we see as the movement of all of the blood from the right ventricle to the lungs and then back into the left ventricle to be distributed across the rest of the body. This movement, for it to count as a lesser circulation, would have to be unidirectional and would have to be for all blood. I'm really emphasizing that. For it to be called circulation, it needs to be unidirectional. It cannot be coming back into the right ventricle from the lungs back into the right ventricle. It must be going only in one direction, and it would have to be for all blood. Now, these people, these academic historians or adjacent, have maintained that this was mere guesswork, not grounded in any other changes in medical theory, and they claim it was the only conclusion Ibn Nafis could reach after he knew that there was no pores in the septum wall separating the left and right ventricles of the heart, and that this had no impact on subsequent physicians. So these are the views of these academic historians or adjacent. The other views are those of Muslim or Arab physicians and non-academics, like the 1001 Inventions, but which are trying to popularize it, right? So, for example, the late Dr. Abdul Halim pushes really hard in this quote that I have in front of you, that Ibn Nafis came up with this understanding of pulmonary circulation and even discovered the exchange between the pulmonary artery and vein through capillaries. He also claims that Ibn Nafis rejected the ebb and flow found in Galen, by which, of course, is meant that blood goes in both directions in pulmonary arteries and veins. Dr. Abdul Halim seemed to suggest that Ibn Nafis did not think of that or think that way. He believed in unidirectionality of some case. And hence, he laid the groundwork for circulation. This is Dr. Abdul Halim's quote. The 1001 Inventions, this is the second edition. It was changed slightly in the later edition, but I think this still dominates a lot of people's views. Makes it seem like Ibn Nafis has posited the full circulation of blood, since they refer to nutritive blood nourishing through veins and spirituous blood after it's gone through lungs nourishing through the arteries. So coming back to the title's talk's title, sorry. Did Ibn Nafis discover circulation? My short answer, which I will now then develop more fully, is that almost everything that I have just mentioned in these quotations, from the academics to the Muslim physicians and the specialist, non-specialist writings like 1001 Inventions, are wrong. Almost everything inside in these quotes is wrong, right? Instead, what I will claim and then show you over the course of this talk, I hope, is that, and some of which I've already published in my first book on Ibn Nafis in 2013, and then in subsequent journal articles over the last decade, and also form part of my second book entitled In Ibn Nafis's Shadow, which is almost nearing completion, inshallah, within the next year. So these are going to be my claims. Ibn Nafis did make novel claims and it did have an impact, but he never said circulation. It was pulmonary transit of blood, and I'll explain that in detail shortly. He did make systematic changes in underlying physiology, quite a lot of them. He had a new theory of pulse. He had a new understanding of humors. He had a new anatomical understanding, not just of the heart and lungs, but also of the gastrointestinal tract, and also, it turns out, of the uterus and some other aspects too. And his new theories were, in fact, widely discussed, debated, accepted, and or modified by subsequent physicians. The ones I'm looking at, they were pretty much in this mold. There are a couple of others in which case he was rejected, but it was always with an eye towards they engaged with it, and their rejections led to further developments in a different direction from what existed prior, right? Um, these are, of course, not the only changes that you're seeing in front of your screen right now that Ibn Nafis came up with or his successors came up with. These are not the only ones in medical theory, let alone in medical practice. But these are the ones that I will focus on today, right? So, in brief, to respond to the question of the title of the talk, Ibn Nafis did not propose pulmonary circulation or blood circulation. However, what he proposed was novel, different from all earlier understandings of the anatomy of the heart and lungs, and it was based on a combination of observations and logical derivations, exactly what you expect from modern scientists and physicians, and of course also from earlier pre-modern and ancient physicians. It was also immersed in the particular theoretical concepts he had inherited, and he was working from within them, again, just like modern scientists and physicians behave as well. And subsequent physicians then evaluated his claims from various angles, sometimes agreeing with him, and at other times disagreeing with him because it created other problems. And I'm not going to get too much into the second half of it. I do in my book. Thus, the key part is there is no decline in scientific activity after Ibn Nafis, i.e., after 1288 or so. But it is also true that there is no modern theory of blood circulation or modern understanding of pulse that develops thus far from what I have seen. Right. So my job now is to convince you of how we can talk about scientific innovation and creativity and advances, even if they do not arrive in modern science directly. And again, I will have you bear in mind that, even if we don't believe in an ether anymore, or even if we don't believe that there is a absolute view of there's such a thing as absolute space or absolute time, which is what's needed in Newton's universe, that doesn't make what Newton was doing ridiculous or not worth it. Of course, those are important developments and stuff, right? And that's what I'm going to try to hopefully show with Ibn Nafis. So let's start with the works that I'll be dealing with because they haven't really been engaged with that much, right? These are some of the medical works I'll be mentioning through my talk. Actually, really won't be talking about Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, but he's a big component, and I've left out a couple of others that I work with. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, 5 books, was one of the key texts, as a lot of you may already know, for medical teaching and learning and building upon in medical practice from, I would say, about the 1200. It's from 1000s, but really from 1200 onwards, takes over the Islamic world and continues to guide Unani medical tradition in the subcontinent right now. It was also actually the main medical text for learning in Renaissance period and Latin Europe all the way up until 1720s or so, and even consulted thereafter. Right. The text, of course, exists in multiple Arabic editions. Many of them are older ones, and there are some problems with them. And English translations, and again, there are some problems with them in terms of how they understand the text, and so forth. There's an abridgment of the canon called the Epitome, which is usually attributed to Ibn Nafis, which took over quite a bit afterwards, right? And of course, the Epitome is a text that has also been edited and published, but not really worked upon as much. Going back to Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, I will say that the Canon of Medicine not only brings together earlier Greek medicine of Galen with the philosophy of Aristotle, but in doing so, it often makes its new contributions in medical theory that are distinct from both and novel in their own rights. And I'll present at least one example of that in this talk. But I've published on Ibn Sina's account of sleep, which goes beyond Aristotle and Galen and became the standard account of sleep in Islamic societies and early modern Europe. Getting to Ibn Nafis's commentary, Remember, I mentioned that the epitome, the abridgment of the canon, and Ibn Sina's canon of medicine itself both exist in editions at least, and the canon of medicine even in translation. Ibn Nafis's commentary on the canon, the massive commentary on all five books, only exists in manuscript. The only part that has been edited has been the anatomical portion of the commentary, which has been edited and is actually available. And it was the anatomical sections of his commentary were appended at the end of his book one commentary to Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. The commentary of Ibn Nafis on all of the canon is 1 million words long. What I'm going to share with you is not even less than 10% of that text. So this is all as a plea to young people who are watching, or even not so young people who are watching and are interested in the history of Islamic medicine. That's how much work needs to be done, right? That's just one person's work who was very influential, as you will see shortly. But his book is his manuscript, just this one commentary is 1 million words, and he wrote many, many, many other medical works. The next three commentaries that I'll be engaging with, and in addition to Qutbuddin, or I should at least add Qutbuddin Shirazi over here, also wrote a commentary in the canon. It's only on book one of the Canon of Medicine, and that is 1.5 million words. Again, to give you the scope, and it's only in commentary. Although I've heard there's an edition being prepared of some parts of the first book now. The epitome commentaries, the three of them, Sadid ad-Din al-Qaziruni, Jamal ad-Din al-Aqsarai, and Nafis ibn Iwad al-Kirmani, are to this day in India known as the Sadidi, the Aqsarai, and Nafisi. Are the three commentaries. They were the most widely used commentaries in the epitome. So I'm not picking up obscure manuscripts. I'm picking up the most well-read texts for about 5 centuries, well, depending on which person we're going to pick and count the centuries from. Um, there are some 19th century editions of these works, but I've tended to use the manuscripts alongside those lithographs and editions, and they range from anywhere between 300,000 words to 500,000 words. The final commentary of Hakim Shah ibn al-Mubarak al-Qazwini only exists in manuscripts and is over 500,000 words, right? Again, these are not obscure works. As I mentioned, the Sadidi, the Aqsarai, and Nafisi are the most widely read Yunani commentaries still on the epitome. Ibn Sina, everyone's heard of. Ibn Nafis's work was copied a lot and existed as well, so it's true for Qutbuddin al-Shirazi. And al-Shirazi, Ibn al-Mubarak, and Kirmani all were working in elite courts and some point dedicated their works to rulers. Shirazi dedicated his commentary to the vizier of the Ilkhanate court ruler Ol-Jaitu. Kirmani dedicated his commentary to the Timurid ruler Ulugh Bey in Samarkand, in whose court he served as a physician. And Ibn al-Mubarak was a physician of the Ottoman courts of Bayezid, Salim, and Suleiman. Ibn Nafis himself was from Damascus, but lived much of his life in Cairo and was in the larger circle of the Mamluk ruler Sultan Mansur al-Qalawun, who founded the major Mansuri hospital. So again, not obscure works. In fact, they're the most popular medical works in Islamic societies, ranging from the Balkans to the Bengal between the period of 1300 and 1900. And this is evidence from various things: manuscript survival, marginalia on manuscripts, how many of them are extant, biobibliographic information, and so forth. And a final point on the social movements of these scholars, right? They moved around a lot, as did their works, right? So this is just a quick map to show you with some of their movements. This includes all 8 that I work on, including Fakhruddin and As-Samiri, but we can focus on the 5 commentator, the 6 I've mentioned otherwise. Right, and just to give you a sense about how much the works moved, Al-Aqsarai, who you will see in the dark blue, is shown as going from Anatolia down to Cairo and then back up to Anatolia. He wrote a commentary in Anatolia, modern day Turkey, in the 1350s or so, approximately then. It was known to, on the east side, you will see in the orange, Al-Kirmani, when he was sitting in Kerman, already when he started writing his commentary in the late 1380s, 90s or so, somewhere around that time. And then, of course, he moved to Samarkand when he wrote it. And then his students had access to both those commentaries and were producing copies of it in Herat, right, where they moved. And we've got a manuscript of Herat with Al-Aqsarai's commentary on the epitome, Kirmani students' notes on it. It's now sitting in the Bodleian Library here in Oxford. We have another commentary of Aqsarai, which engages with Kirmani's commentaries in the Marginalia, also produced from Herat, but sitting now in Turkey's Suleymaniye library, right? So it just gives you a sense about how much these works moved and how much people were working on it. And of course, Ibn al-Mubarak, who's sitting in Istanbul, the purple one showing going to Constantinople on this map, right, had access to both Kirmani and Aksaray, and in fact al-Khazaruni's commentaries when he composed his own in the 1500s. To give you a sense again, my final slide on social history and stuff, this is what some of those manuscripts look like. The top left is Ibn Nafis. They actually go in chronological order, clockwise, from top left onwards. So that's Ibn Nafis. It's a Huntington manuscript from the Bodleian Library in Oxford of the commentary and the canon. The one in the center is also a Bodleian Oxford Library manuscript now in its possession, but it's Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's commentary, and in fact it has his gift to a librarian in his own handwriting, whom he had then sent his copy to. On the top right is that Herat manuscript I talked about of Aksarai's commentary that has marginalia, which are from Kirmani students, right? And then on the bottom right is Kirmani's own manuscript, possibly written in his own hand with the dedication to Ulugh Bey in Samarkand. And on the bottom left is a commentary of Ibn al-Mubarak's in his own hand, in fact, his working final draft of the manuscript, right? And then we have, of course, later commentaries, much more, clean copies is what I would say, produced later. All right, so now with that social background, hopefully in the next 25 minutes or so, let me go over some of the key developments, right? So what is pulmonary transit and what is it that Ibn Nafis proposed? We need to understand three things before we recognize Ibn Nafis's achievements. First, in their medical system, there is no unidirectional movement of substances. The parts of the body attract things they need and repel things that they do not. So the hand brings nourishment in the form of humors to itself through veins by attraction, and then expels unused humors and waste products through those same veins. So there's multi-directional flow or bidirectional flow in the veins that moves up and down. The same is true for the arteries. The hand would attract the spirit to itself to receive innate heat and be alive, and I'll come back to this. And once the spirit is used, the waste products are sent back through those same arteries, right? Galen knew that there were no visible pores in the septum wall of the heart. He knew this. He had dissected, he had found them. He claimed that there were none. He claimed that there were invisible pores, and he reasoned they were such because of the sizes of the two ventricles. And because, third, Galen knew that there is blood naturally present in the arteries. It has to get there somewhere. As far as he was concerned, it was part of what was called the pneumatic system, or the idea is that air is breathed in, goes to the lungs, is kind of warmed up, goes into the left side of the heart, gets cooked up, is generated into pneuma or spirit, and that is what goes up and down arteries. But he recognized that blood is also naturally present. It has to get there somehow. And so he said that there were invisible pores in the septum wall. And of course, some exchange takes place between veins and arteries throughout the body when they become very fine. Those are the two ways blood gets into arteries for Galen. But not because of any circulation, but rather from the same principles of attraction. And he justified this blood in the arteries as having a role in nourishing members that need that type of humoral nutrition. So he says, blood, black bile, phlegm, and yellow bile need to be kind of airy and light to nourish members that are airy and light like lungs. And he says arterial blood is what nourishes them. Ibn Sina in the canon of medicine had accepted much of this from Galen, but he also claimed that there was a third ventricle in the heart, going back to an earlier theory of Aristotle. And it is against these views that Ibn Nafis then says the following. He says, Ibn Sina says there are three ventricles in the heart, and Ibn Nafis then says, this is incorrect, for there are only two ventricles in the heart, the first of which is filled with blood, which is right, and the other is filled with the spirit, ruh, which is the left, and there are definitely no pores between these two ventricles, otherwise the blood would be transported to the location of the spirit and ruin its substance, right? And as he says, these pores are neither visible nor invisible. So he says when the blood is refined in the right ventricle, it is transported to the left ventricle where the spirit is generated. However, there is no passage between the two ventricles, for there the body of the heart is solid and there are no visible passages, as believed by the majority, nor an invisible passage appropriate for transporting the blood as believed by Galen. Think about that. How can one disprove the existence of invisible pores by observation? They're invisible by definition, right? And Galen knew that. As for thinking that you could use a dead heart and pour stuff into the right and see it does not come out of the left, well, again, they knew that. But remember, the movement is not mechanical for them, but based on attraction. So Galen himself could explain why the blood does not seep in dead hearts, yet maintain that there were invisible pores through which it could seep into the left ventricle when the heart was alive, because it's that living part that's attracting and not the dead one. So, what are the theoretical modifications needed for Ibn Nafis to be so certain that there are no invisible pores? Well, this requires some entering into his system to realize what is going on. It all begins with an understanding of what it means to be living. For them, this is the soul. This is not theological, but a physical, philosophical, scientific, and medical understanding. The difference between a living animal and a dead animal is that a living animal is capable of nourishing itself, sensing, and moving, while a dead animal cannot do that, even if the body is the same. It is the soul that gives the animal these powers or faculties. Soul in Arabic here is nafs. Ibn Sina had made some major changes in how this soul, which he took to be immaterial, uniform, and single, i.e., that one human body does not have many souls or many parts of soul, but just one soul, and how this gives these powers, it gives its powers to the body. The spirit, the Arabic ruh, was seen as the essential instrument of this soul. Again, this is a medical ruh understanding, not the theological one that people otherwise have. I can address that in questions if need be. This is present in Galen too, but there are differences between Galen and Ibn Sina that I'm going to skip over for time constraints and just present the final version of Ibn Sina before getting into Ibn Nafis. For Ibn Sina, this spirit was generated in the left side of the heart, not just by cooked air as in Galen, but a mixture of air and blood in the humors. And once the spirit was generated, it received all of the powers of the body, ability to sense, move, nourish, all of them in the heart. However, sensation and movement, Ibn Sina knew, were governed by the brain. So he said the spirit, even though it has these powers, cannot actually exercise them until the spirit arrives in the brain and is cooked further or refined further, and then it's capable of issuing the powers of sensation and movement to the rest of the parts through the nerves. And he said that the liver similarly transforms the spirit so that the powers of nourishment can be distributed. However, in the case of the liver, it gets even more complicated because the liver is not needed for nourishment after this first initial stage. After that, the each individual part has the power of nourishment in its own on its own. What Ibn Nafis is saying in this passage that I have kept up there for a while is that since the spirit is generated from blood and air, if the blood is too thick, this will make it harder to generate a fine enough spirit which can be distributed quickly across the body. And the spirit also needs to have a very specific temperament. If the spirit is too thick, it is not conducive for the various actions it has to undertake. So if the thick blood of the right side seeps into the left side from invisible pores, that would corrupt the temperament of the spirit and negate its purpose. Thus, in healthy individuals, some of the blood is warmed by the heart, makes its way into the lungs, which attract this blood for nourishing themselves. So for Ibn Nafis, arterial blood is not what's nourishing lungs. It's the venal blood coming from the right side of the heart. There, once the blood arrives in the lungs, only the finest particles of this warmed blood seep through the what he calls the artery-like vein, for us is a pulmonary artery, and gets into the space of the lumen of the lungs and mixes with the air over there, which has been warmed by the lungs. And this mixture of the finer parts of blood mixed with air then enters into what he calls the vein-like artery, which for us is a pulmonary vein, and from there enters into the left ventricle of the heart, which attracts this mixture to itself, from which it can generate the spirit. And the spirit is then disseminated by the left ventricle to the rest of the parts through the aorta. The rest of the blood found in the artery-like vein, the pulmonary artery, ends up nourishing the lungs themselves. This is why I insist on pulmonary transit, because A, only a part of the blood from the right side makes its way to the left side of the heart via the lungs, while the rest of the blood from the right side is used up for nourishing the lungs or is used to send the waste and unused blood back down the veins. Again, no unidirectional flow for Ibn Nafis. And B, the main job of the arteries is still to distribute spirit and bring waste back to the lungs to be exhaled. Again, not a unidirectional flow. There is blood in them, but it is a remnant for Ibn Nafis that does not seem to have any other role except to nourish the arteries themselves and provide matter from which spirit is generated. But this does not mean that Ibn Nafis did not make major changes to the underlying system. The pulmonary transit is an anatomical result that is deeply intertwined with his rethinking of the entire soul spirit body relationship and understanding the role of what were deemed to be faculties and chief organs in the earlier system. And in addition to the pulmonary transit, this also yields for him a new anatomical understanding of the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, as well as a new understanding of humors and how nutrition works. Due to time limitations, I cannot cover all of the changes, but we'll go over some of the key ones quickly so that, inshallah, we have some time left over for question and answers. Returning back to Ibn Sina, you will recall he had stated that there was only one soul which passed all its faculties to the spirit and the heart, but the brain and the liver had to modify the spirit so that they can oversee the actions of nourishment and sensation and movement. As for the heart's role, Ibn Sina had maintained with Galen that it was a source of a faculty that is responsible for pulse, which again is not a mechanical motion for Ibn Sina and Galen, but rather an expansion and contraction that comes from a faculty present in the coverings or the tunics of the arteries themselves, distributed by the heart. And as such, for Ibn Sina and Galen, all of the arteries and the heart's left ventricle expand and contract together. Ibn Sina also mentioned that heart is also the source of innate heat, and it bestows, at some points, he calls it a quwwat al-haya, which means kind of an enlivening or an animating faculty. He stated that without receiving this faculty, no part could nourish itself, nor was sensation and motion possible. Ibn Nafis rejected most of this. He stated that a power or faculty is the ability to do something. So it makes little sense that the spirit in the heart receives the faculty for sensation, but somehow then the arteries, somehow that our faculty is not activated until it goes into the brain. So he rejected that. He stated this means that the spirit only receives the sensitive faculties when it arrives actually in the brain. As for nourishment, he said the liver does not even distribute these faculties through the veins because these are innate and the soul gives them directly to each part of the body by virtue of the body being ensouled. On the vital faculty, he says there is no such thing. He will explain that pulse is actually a mechanical motion, and I shall move to that shortly. But he accepted the central role of the heart in ensuring that the body is somehow animated. Here he generated, building upon Ibn Sina's reference to a faculty of life or animation, quwwat al-haya, this notion that the heart is indeed the source of movement, but not movement that is under our control or volition. What he called was something called natural. He used his terminology to say that the heart partakes or undertakes a motion called the natural volitional motion. And this is also what is passed to these other members. He said this motion is only possible through the power of the soul, and it is not needed for nourishment, which is why plants don't have a heart or the spirit, but only for the higher faculties of sensation and volitional motion, which are received once the spirit gets to the brain. So how does that change pulse and nutrition? On pulse, he says clearly that he does not think this is due to the vital faculty at all. But notice that he says that it is due to the volitional faculty, which he later explains is called the natural volitional faculty, al-quwa al-iradiyya al-tabi'iyya. And this is the same faculty that is also responsible for food moving down the GI tract into the stomach and the uterine, and also responsible for the uterine muscle. These are the exact same muscles that, when I was growing up, we used to call them the involuntary muscles, right? And kind of stuff. I know there's a better term now in modern physiology for it. But these are exactly the same muscle groups he picks up. He explained that this is the faculty, for him, it's a faculty of life that the heart receives and distributes to the rest of the members in pulse, bringing innate heat and this type of movement to them. As for how pulse works, he says the following. He says that the expansion of the arteries is natural while their contraction is forced. What forces their contraction is a return of the spirit to the ventricle of the heart, which necessitates the contraction of the arteries to prevent a vacuum. Notice here, it is not fully mechanical, although somewhat, right? What's ended up happening is that the heart expands, but because of its expansion, it sucks back and also calls back to itself the spirit, right? That's what I'm saying. It's partially mechanical, right? And that's what forces the contraction of the artery. So it's the absolute reverse of the way we think about it, right? Yet it makes sense in his system because he wants the spirit to move back and forth so that it can stay extremely hot and very fine in texture. He explains, as you can see, that if it were to stay right, sorry, I hadn't flipped the slide, you can see it now, right? The benefit of the spirit moving towards the heart sometimes and at other times towards the arteries is to maintain its subtlety and substance and not get adversely affected by a lengthy stay in the arteries, right? And remember, he needs the heart spirit to be extremely fine because the brain spirit is going to be cooler and so thicker by nature. But even in the system, he starts to think very much like what's going on in terms of this fluid. And he has this kind of dynamic fluid mechanic mentality that he's going to now put into play. He raises a possible objection. He says, well, if this is the case, then arteries should expand and contract differently depending on their distance from the heart. And Ibn Nafis then responds that actually that is indeed what happens. Right? I didn't put the slide up there with the quote, but he explains, he goes, that's exactly what happens. He goes, the aorta contracts, or I should say, let's talk about the expansion, right? When the heart contracts, he says the aorta expands first as it gets it, and then later on, right? And the arteries in the leg and the aorta are not in the state of expansion and contraction of the same pulse cycle at the same time, right? However, he says these differences are not felt, and this is then a quote, because the time of expansion and contraction of the artery is itself very, very short. So how can the times of the different parts of the arteries expanding and contracting differently really be felt, right? So is this an advance? Well, he recognizes that there is such a thing as involuntary motion due to a specific set of fibers that are not governed by the brain. He picks out the exact muscle groups we pick out now too as being distinct. He recognizes that the pulse is a motion caused by the motion of the heart. However, he thinks only the left ventricle expands and contracts because that is where the spirit is received, and it's the one dealing with the arteries. For him, the right ventricle does not pulse or beat. He also puts the active motion as the heart's expansion, which causes the contraction of the arteries. But he recognizes that different arteries expand and contract at different times, and that this is due to considerations of how fluids would move. So you can see advancements, but it's not circulation, right? Although, right at the end, I'll talk about how in this particular case, his account of pulse actually was known in Latin Europe, and in fact informed the understandings of Colombo, and then subsequently some other physicians too. And of course, Colombo's stuff is picked up by William Harvey. Now, Ibn Nafis's Pulse's teaching, my second point always was that this was not forgotten. And it wasn't. It was widely known and discussed by subsequent commentators. It is found in almost every major commentary on the canon and epitome that came after Ibn Nafis, right? For time's sake, I'm only going to provide two of them, right? So Kazaruni, like those before him, including Ibn Nafis, provides 6 possible teachings of how pulse works, only one of which is Galen's, and only 4 of which are found actually in Galen's corpus, right? He then also includes sufficient detail, as I've provided for the 6th one, of Ibn Nafis's position, though he doesn't come out in favor or against it. He doesn't really say much about it. He just presents them and lets it be, right? Kirmani, on the other hand, accepts Ibn Nafis's position in its entirety, even talking about the back and forth movement of the spirit. That's the quote up in front of you now. The only thing he leaves out, however, is how the heart beats itself. So there's no mention in this long quote on natural volitional motion, which is what results in the heart beating. All he says is that, yeah, but the heart's expansion forces a contraction of the spirit. Sorry, of the arteries by sucking back the spirit. Ibn al-Mubarak builds upon Kirmani and adds the natural volitional motion too. So he says, from amongst them, there are those that claim the movement as volitional, to which the author inclines. This is because the heart possesses sense and the movement of the pulse follows the heart. The fact that we are unconscious of the heart's motion does not necessarily make it non-volitional, since the movement of the eyelids is volitional even when we are unconscious of it, right? So, I mean, there are a number of ways that they are trying to explain how this weird category that he's developing, because from amongst the theoretical tools that he has to try to isolate a particular phenomenon and how that would work. So in this case, we have a partial or complete acceptance of Ibn Nafis's new account of pulse in the most widely read and disseminated commentaries in Islamic societies. His new theories were hardly forgotten. My last example, and hopefully I can then conclude with that, will come from humoral theory. Here we will see that for Ibn Nafis, a very tight connection was made between his anatomical discussions, including the new notion of natural volitional faculty, his revised understanding of chief organs, and the soul-spirit-body connections, all resulted in also revising the physiology of digestion and the generation of humors. It begins again with the fact that he maintains that the soul provides the powers of nourishment directly to each body part, such that each part can attract naturally food to itself and expel waste. So let's start first with how food is brought down to the liver, which was always seen as the site of the generation of blood and the humors. For Ibn Sina and Galen, food moves down the esophagus and into the stomach because the stomach attracts food to itself. Here Ibn Nafis finds a problem. He says if parts only attract nourishment to themselves because they are nourished by it, and nourishment is only done by humors, then why is the stomach bringing food down to itself? He also notes, as we've already seen, that the stomach lining and the esophagus have fibers in them. So he maintains that the food is brought down the stomach, as you can see on your slide there, through the natural volitional faculty. And it is through these faculties that the food moves through the GI tract. The liver, on the other hand, does attract food using just the natural faculty because the chylkine stuff that it's bringing up from the intestines is from which the humors are then generated by liver as after it nourishes itself, right? So that is a natural taking up, but the stomach's take up and that of the intestines is through the natural volitional faculty. Here, Ibn Nafis then also adds an anatomical detail which goes against Galen and those of the past. He states explicitly that the mesenteric veins, and here he's going to talk about the mesenteric veins as both the veins that come to the intestine and the stomach, so no distinction between gastric and mesenteric as two separate. He states explicitly that the mesenteric veins do not enter the pit of the intestines or the stomach, the cavities, right? Rather, they stay on the surface. And in the case of the intestines, he says that the liver draws up nourishment to itself through percolation, ala sabil al-rush. He rejects the penetration into the lumen because he's also worried about the waste of the intestines making their way into the liver. Again, we have an empirically correct claim, but it is defended within his theoretical system, right? And because earlier Islamic physicians would have examined the same set of animals, but yet maintained that the mesenteric veins had entered into the pit of the intestines. In terms of the humors themselves, Ibn Nafis makes a major change in the role played by humors in nourishment. He states that only blood is the real nourishment, while all the other humors, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, are like corrective seasonings. This is a major change, and in the analogy he is making needs to be explained. One adds seasonings or spices to food to change its texture, taste, etc. This means that these humors, like spices, have elemental qualities. However, just as cumin or salt are not the real nourishing aspect of a meal, yellow bile or phlegm too do not nourish the parts of the body themselves. They do not replace and replenish those parts of the body that have been dissolved. The role of replacement and replenishment is accomplished by blood, but it needs to be seasoned appropriately so that that part of the body, so brain will attract only that parts of blood to itself which have a temperament that suit the brain, right? And in order to do that, it needs to be mixed with phlegm, etc., right? And that's why it will draw itself. But phlegm is not the one nourishing the brain. It's a key difference between him and Galen and Ibn Sina and others. Yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm change the blood's texture, taste, and other qualities so they conform to the temperament of the body part that is being nourished. This, of course, had major consequences again for how fluids move into the system, particularly yellow bile in the gallbladder and black bile for spleen in their system. For earlier physicians, the gallbladder and spleen stored yellow bile and black bile so that they can be released for their functions in the body, particularly for the yellow bile, let's say, to evacuate the intestines, right? But as to how they got to these parts, earlier physicians, including Galen, had insisted that yellow bile nourishes gallbladder and the black bile nourishes the spleen. Ibn Nafis rejects this. He said these two organs only store these fluids because they have a warning function, right? They instigate for appetite for black bile and for removing dregs from the intestine in the case of the yellow bile, right? And since blood and phlegm do not have similar functions, they do not have such storage organs. But later he says only the sharpest yellow bile and black bile are sent to the gallbladder and black and spleen, and not the one that is suitable to be used for seasoning the blood, because that goes with the actual blood in the veins, right? In the case of the bile duct, he also differs from earlier physicians, but here we will see how observations can lead to sometimes a wrong claim, but one that fits with his underlying physiology. Ibn Nafis says on a couple of different occasions in his anatomical work that the bile duct stemming from the gallbladder does not actually enter into the intestines, right? And he says he has seen this many times. So again, for those who claim dissections weren't done, there's nothing preventing someone from dissecting an animal and observing it in Islamic law whatsoever, right? So the idea and it's let's just say it's not a simple matter even in the case of humans, but certainly for animals there's no such issue. And Ibn Nafis, the fact that he was dissecting is clear when he turns around and says, well, we've seen this many times, that the gallbladder does not enter into the intestine itself, but rather stays on the surface, right? He insists on this because he's observed it. He says, "Shahidnaha miraran," right? Um, Now, of course, the duct does not enter into, as we know, the bile duct actually does enter into the pit of the intestines, not the stomach, about which he's right, through the sphincter of Oddi. This is a small sphincter which contracts to prevent food and waste to come up the bile duct, but relaxes to allow the bile to directly flow into the duodenum when the gallbladder contracts. The bile duct acquires muscles, and in the case of sheep, this is two layers of muscle around the sphincter of Oddi. And in the sheep in particular, it runs along the intestinal wall before running along the submucosa for a bit before it opens up into a slit in through the intestinal muscles and into the lumen of the duodenum. Ibn Nafis, of course, could have seen this in sheep and not caught on to the fact that this is running around the wall and then finally ending in a sphincter, which actually does enter into the lumen. Or because of his theoretical understanding, he never even bothered to look up. He just saw it going into the muscle and he said, no, it just stays on the surface. Whatever it may have been, right? Could have convinced him very clearly about the bile duct does not enter into the lumen. And of course, this is part of his own notion that just like the mesenteric veins, about which he's right, do not enter into the pit, he's making that analogy with the gallbladder too for the similar purposes. Finally, on his theories being taken up by later physicians, it is found in multiple later commentaries. I'll select just two sets of examples. The first is from Kazaruni. He accepts, though with slightly changed terms, that the blood is the real nutrition and other humors are just assistants. He explains that in the context of how phlegm works with blood to nourish, again, indicating that blood is the one that nourishes and the part of the phlegm used is just to change the texture so that it is picked up by members like the brain. Ibn Mubarak goes even further. He explains it far more thoroughly, though even then he built in terms of how the spices and etc. work, in terms of why certain things need to be mixed with blood to nourish the bones versus those for the brains. But then he also starts building up a bit, or at least spelling out certain things which may be implicit. Right? He says, well, the blood is also used to generate spirit, and the spirit carries the faculties and powers, as all of them agreed. So a decrease in blood also decreases the body's powers. Right? And he even includes the anatomical discussion of the mesenteric veins. So Ibn Mubarak will pick that up and he says, well, the liver absorbs chyle from the stomach and intestines by percolating from them into the fine lattice-like veins, and from them the chyle is conveyed to the liver. It does not enter into the intestines themselves. So in conclusion, I hope over the course of this brief talk, I have shown just two examples from these massive works of the kinds of developments in medicine that were taking place. I did not have time to cover sleep, changes in understanding of faculties of generations, timing of fetal ensoulment, disease history, and much, much more. These works need to be studied in much greater depth to see what kinds of advancements were taking place. Two final things related to advancements, though. We need to get over our obsession with trying to find what counts as a precursor or prior discovery of later modern findings. In the case of circulation, for example, no Islamic physician that I have read thus far ever posited circulation of blood, the same blood going all around and around and around, or even that all of the blood from the right ventricle makes its way into the left ventricle of the heart through the lungs. Right. So they didn't posit circulation, and even the pulmonary transit, as I've shown, was about just some of the blood making its way in. But that still does not mean it is not an advancement in its own right. It is an excellent example of rethinking the theoretical system, taking into account anomalies in the theoretical system as well as in observations, and correcting them as one proceeds. Denting a well-respected theory not overthrown for a long time is just as important in the long run as providing an entirely alternative new theory, which also happens to be the one that we are with now, right? And this brings me to my final point, for which I do have some more slides. Just because we're not looking for precursors, though, and I really want to emphasize, I want to understand these medical works from within their own context. What are they doing? What are they building upon? What are they observing? How are they building the theoretical part? And what's going on in these societies themselves? But we need to recognize these societies were never isolated, right? There was a lot of interaction across the Mediterranean between Latin European scholars and Islamic scholars on the other side of the Mediterranean, and developments in both those regions penetrated into the other regions. Particularly in the case of Latin Europe, this has been erased from many of the history books we read, right? Careful sifting through sources, of course, reveals the connections starkly. And I would maintain that we will have a much better understanding, a much better global, non-Western, non-Eurocentric understanding of the history of science, and a better trajectory of even why Western medicine and Western science took the trajectories it took, why it was obsessed with certain kinds of questions and not, if we take the understandings of Islamic medicine and science and even other engagements which some of my colleagues are doing on Afro-Caribbean and other indigenous medical and scientific traditions, making their way into Europe as well. And again, actively sought out and appropriations. On pulse, for example, and pulmonary transit, it is very visible that Ibn Nafis's new theories were being discussed in Latin Europe. Here are two passages from 16th century luminaries. This is Gabriel Falloppio. He actually rejected the new work coming out of Colombo and pulmonary transit and the pulse theory. However, notice what he says. He says, there's some people who even say that when the arteries are moved, they're moved by accident, i.e., it's not their natural movement, it's a forced movement upon them. And when the heart is contracted, the arteries are dilated, but when the heart is dilated, the arteries collapse as the blood is recalled to the heart. This is Ibn Nafis's theory of pulse, right? And people who studied in the past without knowing Ibn Nafis's theory assumed incorrectly that what was being brought out here by Gabriel Falloppio was an older Greek theory of Erasistratus, right? However, the key difference there is Erasistratus had maintained that the heart pushes material into the arteries and does not recall them back, which is the force. But notice what Falloppio is saying. It is the reverse. It's the sucking back that he's challenging, and he's saying this is widely spread in Renaissance Italy and France and those regions at his time. Similarly, Colombo. It's very famously known that Colombo, in this passage, as you will see, talks about the heart's expansion as systole, which is the exact opposite, right? The expansion is diastole and its contraction is systole. But he calls it the other way around. Of course he does, because the heart's expansion is sucking back, even for him, the stuff in the arteries as they're getting contracted. And for him, that is the active part of the pulse. The quiet, the inactive part, or the idea is where the arteries expand and receive the materials, but their contraction is the one that's forced by the sucking back, and where he's picking this stuff out of, right? Or at least building upon as he's trying to rethink, right? But you make more sense of these passages if you know the Islamic tradition. And with that, I hope I've made enough of a case to show that medicine does not go into decline after 1200 in Islamic societies, even if it does not lead to modern theory of blood circulation. More work, of course, is needed to study the tens and hundreds of manuscripts that can, in both medicine, of course, and in science and philosophy and others, to get a much better understanding of what was evolving in the period between 1200 and 1800. Thank you for listening, and I'll take whatever questions there may be.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Nahyan. Yeah, I'm still kind of reeling from that because that's just very, I mean, it's very interesting because you don't, like you said, he doesn't have to be the one that discovered circulation for him to have been as pivotal as he was with helping us to understand it eventually. Um, and I think that's just the incredible part that he was. So just to clarify real quick, so you're saying that his works were discussed, but not necessarily connected to him.
No, his work. So in the Latin European case, it's interesting because actually, so right in the midst of what's called the pulse controversy in the 1540s, as they're trying to rethink whether pulse is caused by the vital faculty and other things are emerging, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's commentary on the pulse section is published in Latin translation from a guy called Andrea Alpego, who had spent at least a decade, if not more, as the Medici Condotti in Damascus, right? And studied under Muslim physicians. And in fact, it's his new revised translation of the Qanun, the Canon of Medicine in Latin, that is published, I think, also posthumously. He held the chair of theoretical medicine, which was revived in Padua after having been absent for a couple of decades or more, right? It was revived for Andrea Alpego, and he taught there at least for a year, maybe. I can't remember. Again, I don't have all the full dates in my head. And then his new revised translation of the canon was published then, right? Again, either while he was alive or just after he died, right? Posthumously. He had also translated a bunch of other works, which were then published posthumously. And one of them is Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's commentary. And what's fascinating about Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's commentary is on the pulse is Ibn Nafis's entire theory is there in Ibn Nafis's own words, right? And identified with him, right? Including with the marginalia by Alpego, because Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, as with all other Muslim physicians, always referred to Ibn Nafis actually as al-Qurashi by his nisbah. And so Qutbuddin al-Shirazi does the same. He says, all people claim that this is caused by the vital faculty except al-Qurashi.
Mhm.
And Alpego puts it as Curasi, I think, and then has a marginal note in the translation that says Qurashi is Ibn Nafis,
Oh, wow.
right? And
Yeah.
so, I mean, these works were known. I even have actually slides on the gastric mesenteric veins do not enter right there as well in Latin discussion. So the Latin context, they have some knowledge of him, and
Mhm.
maybe it'll take a lot more to figure out exactly what kind of knowledge they may have for digging deep. Arabic, those writing in Arabic, and of course subsequently in Persian and Turkish, know Ibn Nafis
Right.
straight up. He is the one authority that they keep talking about all the time, right? Every single one of them. Kaziruni begins his commentary by saying that he was studying the canon of medicine in the majlis of a philosopher called Burhanuddin al-Ibri, who was Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's student. And he said the best two commentaries on the Qanun that we used to study was Ibn Nafis's commentary on the Qanun and Qutbuddin al-Shirazi's commentary. Of course, what's funny is that Qutbuddin al-Shirazi himself in his commentary says the best commentary written on the Qanun is Ibn Nafis and Ibn al-Quf, right? And in fact, plops all of it down in his own commentary. So when Kazaruni says the best commentaries are Qutbuddin al-Shirazi and Ibn Nafis, it's Ibn Nafis and Ibn Nafis plus some more, right? I mean, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi is pretty much Ibn Nafis's commentary.
Oh, that's incredible. I want to make sure I answer some of the other audience questions. So someone had asked, they're very interested in how these books, in the one of the first slides you had mentioned, how they traveled such large distances.
So I think that's a good question, right? I mean, we need to think about multiple. I mean, people are moving a lot, right? I mean, and I remember showing this at one point in 2014 in New York at something, and I had a Prezi, so it was moving back and forth in the map and stuff too, very dizzying in many ways. But then one person in the audience is like, "Oh wow!" And I get excited when a manuscript moves from Durham to Bath. Right. I mean, just the scale. So how did they move? I mean, many things. I mean, these are major trading kind of places. Their militaries are marching as well. The Hajj is a major source of movement of books and texts and knowledge of books and texts that move in, right? So all of those impact in terms of it. And people's reputations are fascinating. I mean, Fakhruddin Razi himself moves from what would be Rai, close to modern day Tehran, right? All the way to Herat is where he dies. But he also spends some time, unless I'm forgetting where he spends his time. Give me a second, because I don't want to give the wrong information. I do want to say he spent his time in Samarkand, right? Or Bukhara, one of the two. But let me quickly find this as I zip through my slides to get back. Samarkand, yeah, right. So he himself with his students traveled to these places, right? I mean, so a lot of people made journeys for knowledge purposes, right? A lot of traders are going back and forth, right? People are going from Anatolia to Cairo in the 14th century because Cairo is the center where you want to get learning done. A lot of people move because of military and stuff, right? So the Mongols come and invade. So all of Fakhruddin's students, right, some of whom had already moved earlier, but then some who flee and some who die, unfortunately, right, because of the Mongol invasion of Herat and others, right? The movement is forced upon people. As they move. And it's not just these scholars. I mean, we have a copyist. So the Fakhruddin Razi's commentary, which I didn't really touch on today, but his commentary, the manuscript that we have, is copied by a guy called Mosili, right, and it's copied in Herat, very likely from Fakhruddin's own text at some point after Fakhruddin's death, and then he copies another manuscript in Damascus, right, 30 years later. So at some point in his life, he's moved, right, so a lot of people moved. The Hajj, as I said, trading. Knowledge, and then Timur is a great example of forcing people to move, right? He grabbed all of the scholars from like Damascus and many other places and forcefully moved them and Anatolia all the way to Samarkand, right? And then, of course, where the patrons are with the big money, people get attracted, they hear about it and stuff and move. So, yeah.
Right, right. Thank you for that. The next two questions, I guess, kind of similarly that. So, if he didn't, if let's say if Ibn al-Nafis didn't discover circulation per se, could you say that he discovered pulmonary circulation? And then to the last point, right, just about the movement.
Yeah, I think the problem is that circulation means it's circulating. It's the same blood going all around. That's the key, right? And it's all of it. And both of those things do not hold, right? For Ibn Nafis, blood is used up. The spirit is used up. I mean, some of it stays, it goes back and forth, right? But it doesn't circulate. There's no unidirectional flow, right? So, yes, he is going to talk about that any blood, and for him, it's only a small amount of the larger quantity of blood in the body. It's only a smaller amount, significantly small amount, that makes its way into the left side of the heart to generate the spirit, right? Um, that part does go through the lungs, hands down, right? There's no dispute about that. And that small part of the blood doesn't make its way back in to the right side of the heart either, right? So in that way, that small part of the blood, yes, has one directional flow, right? It's not coming back in, but it's a very small part, right? The rest of the part isn't. So that's my problem with using terms like, I mean, we need to know what they mean, right? Lesser circulation only comes into existence as a term once you know about the greater circulation. You cannot put the horse before the cart, right? If there's no circulation of blood, there can be no pulmonary circulation, right? Pulmonary circulation only makes sense when there is circulation of blood. Because let's be honest, even pulmonary circulation, it's not a circuit, right? The circuit's only complete when you have the greater circulation going with it, right? I mean, the only small part, if it is that's coming in, would be, yeah, sure, you can call about a lesser circuit if you say, okay, the blood goes from the lungs into the left side of the heart, and then of course some of that is making its way back in without going around the entire body, but just kind of through the capillaries of the heart and back into the right ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle, and that back up. So there's a kind of small circuit being completed there. There's no such thing in Ibn Nafis whatsoever. So even there's not even that smaller circulation. And so I think our fascination with calling it circulation is again to try to get that attachment rather than turning around and saying, no, he came up with something very, very important, something that people had believed for over 1,000 years, if not longer, that there were invisible pores in the septum wall. He's the one who turns around and says, no, they're not. There's no visible, there's no invisible, right? This goes through the lungs, whatever makes it in. And that's a big achievement and worthy of celebration, even if it's not called circulation.
That's a fair point. No, and that's, kind of like what we talked about earlier, that whether or not it's controversial, right, or maybe emotionally controversial, but it's just the fact that, well, again, talking about the historical evidence, right, and making it about the scientific process of it. And so, which is what our ancestors did. And so
Yeah.
that's, I think, just to make sure we respect everybody's time and Dr. Nahyan's time as well, too. Just, thank you so, so much for this and, just helping us kind of start these series with thinking, maybe not necessarily, I mean, I think we have some answers, which is interesting, but also just a lot of thinking about how did we think about things, right? And what sort of context do we think about it in, and is that always the right context or not? So I'll leave it up to people to have these conversations amongst themselves about as well too. But I think if you all enjoyed this conversation, inshallah, we're gonna have more. Dr. Nahyan's not gonna go anywhere. He's gonna definitely gonna keep continuing to work with us as well too. Not only does NIMS do these webinars, but we also have an actual Quran museum in Illinois as well, in Rolling Meadows. We have tours that our executive director Alia does an excellent job with. She also does the calligraphy workshops as well too. So a lot of stuff that we're offering here at NIMS. All thanks to Dr. Hussein Nagamia, who had the foresight to think of NIMS and to create this initiative. So please subscribe to this YouTube channel that you're looking at this on. And so, continue to follow. We'll definitely have more of these talks. And if there are topics that you want to learn about, please let us know too, because as Dr. Nahyan said, there is there's definitely a lot of material to go through that, if you would agree, Dr. Nahyan, hasn't even been fully translated yet. And so we definitely need people to do that. And I would say not that we need to be inserted back into history, but even everything that's going on in the Middle East right now, Gaza, Lebanon, that I think now more than ever, we need to know the achievements that we did in the past to give us the confidence to know where we came from and the good that we can do for the world itself, inshallah. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for all those who listened in. And inshallah, next time, assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you again so much.